My husband thought I was too loyal to ever investigate him. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was letting his mistress humiliate me in public. Because 3 hours later I was hiding in a parking garage watching both of them destroy their own lives. She still doesn't know. The woman laughed softly inside my husband's car, and even through the cracked parking garage window I heard every word. Then my husband answered, "No, Emily trusts me too much." I sat frozen in the darkness of my SUV staring at the man I had spent 21 years loving, while the woman beside him rested her hand casually on his arm like she had every right to be there. And maybe she thought she did. Because betrayal never begins with one lie. It begins the moment someone decides your loyalty makes you easy to fool. The parking garage beneath Dalton Freight Systems smelled like concrete oil and hot summer rain. Midnight security lights reflected across rows of parked vehicles, while thunder rolled faintly over downtown Dallas, and somewhere above me, an elevator door opened and closed with a hollow metallic sound. But inside my car, the world had gone completely still. Daniel leaned closer to the woman in the passenger seat and smiled in a way I had not seen in years, not politely, not distractedly, but warmly, intimately, like a man whose real life had finally begun. The woman laughed again. Vanessa Reed, one of his coworkers. The same woman who had looked directly at me during the office charity dinner earlier that evening and said, "You seriously don't know who that woman is?" At the time, several employees nearby suddenly became very interested in their drinks. Nobody met my eyes. Nobody spoke. I remembered forcing a small smile while humiliation crawled slowly up my throat. Then I walked away before anyone could see the confusion on my face. Now, less than 4 hours later, I understood everything. I watched Daniel touch Vanessa's cheek gently before starting the engine, and something inside me cracked so quietly I almost missed it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the soft death of certainty. I waited until his SUV disappeared out of the garage before lowering my phone. My recording had captured everything: their conversation, their faces, the kiss, the laughter. Evidence. The word suddenly felt cold and adult and terrifying. 21 years of marriage had somehow become evidence. I drove home through heavy Texas rain with both hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. Traffic lights blurred through water streaking across the windshield, while old memories surfaced one after another like ghosts demanding recognition. Daniel teaching our son Mason to throw a baseball in the backyard. Daniel holding my hand during my mother's funeral. Daniel standing in our unfinished kitchen 15 years earlier, promising me that one day when life slowed down, I could finally open the bakery I always dreamed about. Life never slowed down. His father got sick. Mason developed asthma. Bills multiplied. I left my bookkeeping job temporarily to stay home with our son, and temporary slowly became permanent. Somewhere inside those years, my world became smaller while Daniel's became larger. At first, I told myself that was marriage. Sacrifice, partnership, compromise. Now I wondered whether I had simply disappeared so gradually that I failed to notice. By the time I pulled into our driveway, it was after 1 a.m. The house sat silent beneath the rain-warm porch lights glowing against wet pavement. Home. Or at least the place I used to believe was safe. I walked inside quietly and found Mason asleep on the living room couch with a blanket draped over him. At 16, he was all long arms and exhausted teenage energy, one sneaker hanging halfway off his foot, while a late-night sports recap played silently on television. I stood there for a moment watching him breathe. Children trusted the stability of a home the same way they trusted gravity. They assumed it would always hold. And suddenly I felt furious, not because Daniel betrayed me, but because he risked shattering the one thing our son still believed in completely. I turned off the television and headed upstairs. Daniel's side of the bed remained untouched. Of course. I sat slowly on the mattress staring at the framed wedding photo beside the lamp. We looked impossibly young in that picture. Daniel wore his marine dress blues because he had just finished active duty the year before. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings and smiled like someone who still believed love alone could protect a marriage from ordinary human weakness. My phone buzzed suddenly. Daniel. I stared at the screen until it almost stopped ringing. Then I answered. Hey, I said softly. Still at your sister's place? He asked casually. The lie arrived so easily. Earlier that afternoon, I had told him Claire needed help after minor surgery, so I might stay overnight in Fort Worth. Yes, I replied. You okay? I closed my eyes. The concern in his voice sounded real. That was the terrifying thing about betrayal. Sometimes the person hurting you still remembered how you take your coffee. Sometimes they still sounded gentle. Human beings rarely transformed into villains all at once. Everything's fine, I whispered. You heading home tomorrow? Probably. All right, drive safe. Storm's getting bad. Storm's getting bad. Meanwhile, he had just spent the evening wrapped around another woman inside a parking garage. After we hung up, I sat motionless in the darkness for a long time. Then slowly, I opened Daniel's nightstand drawer. I don't know what instinct drove me to do it. Maybe some buried part of me already understood that affairs rarely existed alone. Lies tended to build systems around themselves. Inside the drawer sat old receipts, charging cables, loose change, and beneath them, folded neatly beside a flashlight, a cream-colored envelope. Peterson and Klein family attorneys. My stomach tightened instantly. I pulled out the papers. Confidential divorce consultation. The date printed at the top was nearly 4 months old. For several seconds, I genuinely could not breathe. Not because of the affair anymore. Because this meant planning, preparation, strategy. Daniel hadn't simply fallen in love with someone else. He had been building an exit quietly while kissing me goodbye every morning. Thunder shook the windows softly outside while I kept reading. Asset evaluation. Property division estimates. Custody considerations regarding minor child. Minor child. The language itself felt brutal. Cold. Clinical. Our life reduced to paperwork. I lowered the documents slowly into my lap and stared across the bedroom we had shared for 2 decades. The dresser we bought secondhand during our first year married the ceiling fan. Daniel installed himself the stack of folded laundry waiting near the closet. Ordinary things. That was the cruelest part. Disaster almost always arrived in ordinary rooms. And somewhere deep inside the shock beneath the humiliation and heartbreak, another feeling quietly began unfolding. Not rage. Clarity. Because for the first time in years, I suddenly understood something with absolute certainty. The man sleeping with another woman believed I would never survive without him. And maybe that was the biggest mistake he would ever make. For the next 3 weeks, I behaved exactly the way my husband expected me to behave. Calm, dependable, oblivious. I made coffee before he came downstairs each morning. I asked Mason about school groceries shopped on Tuesdays, folded laundry, while cable news murmured softly through the living room, and listened to Daniel complain about staffing problems at Dalton Freight Systems as though I still believed every word leaving his mouth. Meanwhile, I began collecting pieces of the truth. Quietly. That was the advantage of being underestimated for years. People stopped watching you carefully once they decided you were harmless. Daniel certainly had. Every night after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the downstairs office with my laptop open, organizing bank statements, screenshots, receipts, and recordings into folders like someone assembling evidence for a trial. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The affair had been going on for at least 11 months. Possibly longer. Hotel charges appeared during regional meetings. Jewelry purchases surfaced 2 weeks before Valentine's Day, despite the fact that Daniel bought me nothing but flowers from the grocery store this year. There were cash withdrawals I couldn't explain, dinners charged to corporate accounts, fuel purchases near Vanessa's apartment complex. The lies weren't reckless. That was what frightened me most. They were disciplined. One Thursday afternoon, while cleaning out old storage bins in the garage, I found something even worse. A locked metal cash box hidden behind paint cans on the top shelf. The key was taped beneath the workbench. Inside sat nearly $18,000 in cash. I counted it twice because my brain refused to accept the number the first time. $18,000. Daniel spent the last 2 years warning me about money constantly. He complained whenever I ordered takeout, too often postponed replacing our broken dishwasher because things were tight, and once lectured me for buying expensive baking pans after Christmas. Apparently, finances were only tight when the spending involved me. I sat alone on the garage floor staring at stacks of $100 bills while something cold and humiliating settled into place inside my chest. This wasn't an affair built on passion. It was an escape plan. That night, Daniel came home smiling. Actually smiling. He kissed my forehead while I stirred soup on the stove and asked whether Mason still needed money for baseball camp next month. The normalcy of it nearly made me sick. "You okay?" he asked casually. "You seem tired lately." I looked at him carefully then. 47 years old, slight gray beginning near his temples. Strong shoulders from years in freight logistics and warehouse work. The same man who once drove 6 hours through a snowstorm just to surprise me on my birthday during our engagement. And suddenly I understood something deeply painful. People did not become strangers overnight. Sometimes they simply revealed parts of themselves you never wanted to see. "I'm fine," I answered softly. He nodded and grabbed a beer from the refrigerator. "You know Vanessa's organizing another charity fundraiser next month." My stomach tightened instantly, though I kept my expression neutral. "No, I didn't." "She's good at that stuff." He took a drink. "Honestly, she's one of the smartest people in the office." Interesting. People always revealed more than they intended when guilt made them careless. "And kind of intense," he added with a faint laugh. Kind. That word echoed bitterly through my head after seeing the way Vanessa smirked at me in the parking garage. Later that evening, after Mason went upstairs, Daniel fell asleep in front of the television while I cleaned the kitchen alone. I watched him for a long moment from across the room. Then I realized something strange. I no longer wanted him back. 3 weeks earlier, that realization would have shattered me. Now it brought relief. Because once love became contaminated by humiliation, it changed shape. Slowly, irreversibly. The next morning, I called my sister Claire. "You sound different," she said immediately. Claire worked as a trauma nurse in Phoenix, which meant she could detect emotional damage in someone's voice faster than most therapists. "I found divorce paperwork," I told her quietly, "and hidden cash." Silence. Then, "How bad?" "Bad enough." I explained everything: the affair, the parking garage, the financial records, the attorney documents. Claire listened without interrupting while I sat at the kitchen table staring through the window at our backyard. Finally, she exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said calmly. "First thing you need to understand is this: do not panic publicly." I haven't. Good. Because once a man realizes he's losing control of the narrative, he becomes unpredictable. Narrative. Interesting word. Claire continued. "You need a lawyer immediately. A good one. Not revenge. Emily, protection." Protection. That word stayed with me long after we ended the call. Because until then, I hadn't fully admitted how vulnerable I actually was. I left my bookkeeping career 15 years earlier to raise Mason and support Daniel's career. The house was jointly owned, but most long-term investments were handled through Daniel's retirement accounts and corporate benefits. I had some freelance income through occasional accounting work and custom baking orders, but not enough to comfortably survive alone. And Daniel knew that, which explained the hidden cash, the planning, the confidence. 3 days later, I met Sandra Bishop. Her office sat above a coffee shop in downtown Plano inside a renovated brick building with tall windows and dark hardwood floors. Sandra herself looked exactly like the kind of woman who frightened dishonest men, sharp-eyed, composed, silver-haired, and utterly unimpressed by emotional manipulation. She listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, she folded her hands. "Do you want to save your marriage?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. I thought about the parking garage, the lies, the hidden money, the way Vanessa smiled at me like I was already irrelevant. And strangely enough, the answer arrived easily. "No." Sandra nodded once, almost approvingly. "Good. That makes this simpler." I almost laughed. "Nothing about this feels simple." "No," she replied calmly, "but clarity helps." She reviewed the financial documents, carefully making notes while I sat across from her, trying not to unravel emotionally. Then she looked directly at me. "Your husband isn't just cheating," she said quietly. "He's preparing strategically, which means he assumes you won't notice until it's too late." I swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" Sandra slid a yellow legal pad across the desk. "You stop behaving like someone waiting to be abandoned." The sentence landed harder than anything else she said all afternoon. Because deep down I realized she was right. For years, my entire life revolved around maintaining stability for everyone else. Daniel's career, Mason's health, family schedules, financial compromises. Meanwhile, I slowly disappeared inside the machinery of other people's needs. Sandra leaned back in her chair. "What did you love before survival became your full-time job?" I stared at her. Then unexpectedly, I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Baking." "Professional. I wanted to open a bakery once." "What happened?" I looked down at my wedding ring. "Life." Sandra nodded slowly as though she had heard that answer from women 1,000 times before. Then she said something that changed me. "Emily, men like your husband often mistake sacrifice for weakness. Don't help him make that mistake again." When I left her office that afternoon, the Texas heat hit me like a wall. But for the first time since discovering the affair, I no longer felt lost. I felt awake. Sandra told me something during our second meeting that stayed with me long after I left her office. "Most women think the breaking point is discovering the affair," she said while reviewing financial statements across her desk. "It isn't. The real breaking point is realizing how long they've been taught to survive disappointment quietly." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Then I went home. And suddenly, I saw my entire marriage differently. I noticed how automatically I apologized whenever Daniel sounded irritated. I noticed how often I adjusted my schedule around his moods, his meetings, his exhaustion. Even after discovering the affair, some damaged part of me still instinctively wanted to keep the household emotionally comfortable for him. That realization embarrassed me more than the cheating itself. Because betrayal didn't happen in a vacuum. It grew slowly inside unequal relationships where one person became increasingly invisible. Over the next month, I started rebuilding pieces of myself quietly. Not dramatically. Not in the cinematic way movies portrayed reinvention. Real transformation looked much smaller at first. I reopened my old baking page online. Sweet Haven Bakery. The account still contained faded photos from years earlier, apple pies, wedding cakes, cinnamon rolls arranged beside handwritten recipe cards. Looking through them felt strangely emotional, like visiting a younger version of myself I abandoned somewhere along the way. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I uploaded my first new post in almost 8 years. "Fresh orders available again." Simple words. But my hands still shook while pressing publish. The first order came 2 days later from a woman named Denise Harper who wanted cupcakes for her granddaughter's birthday party. $48 total. I nearly cried after she paid me. Not because of the money. Because someone saw value in something that belonged only to me. Daniel barely noticed at first. That was the advantage of people underestimating you. They often ignored the early stages of your independence because it seemed too small to threaten them. Every morning, I woke before sunrise and baked while the house remained silent. Flour dust covered the counters, Butter softened beside mixing bowls while soft country music played through my phone speaker. By 8 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like vanilla cinnamon and fresh bread. For the first time in years, I felt useful outside the role of wife and mother. Alive even. Then came the first crack in Daniel's carefully controlled confidence. One Friday evening, he walked into the kitchen while I packaged cookies for a school fundraiser. "What's all this?" he asked casually. "Orders." He frowned slightly. "You're getting a lot lately." "A few." Daniel opened the refrigerator, staring at stacked cake containers. "You should be careful not to overwhelm yourself." There it was again. That tone. Concern disguised as limitation. Weeks earlier, his comment might have made me doubt myself. Now I heard the truth underneath it clearly: stay manageable. Stay dependent. Stay exactly who I'm comfortable with. "I'm fine," I replied calmly. He nodded slowly but kept watching me. And for the first time since I discovered the affair, I sensed uncertainty in him. Not guilt. Concern. Because something about me had started changing in ways he no longer understood. 3 nights later, I uncovered the reason Daniel suddenly seemed nervous. He left his smartwatch charging on the bathroom counter while showering downstairs after Mason's baseball game. Notifications lit up the screen one after another. "Vanessa, read. Can't keep waiting forever." Then another message. "You promised this would be done before Christmas." My pulse slowed instantly. Not sped up. Slowed. Because at that exact moment, everything finally became clear. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a temporary affair Daniel regretted but didn't know how to end. This was a planned transition. He intended to replace me carefully and quietly, while preserving as much comfort, money, and reputation as possible. I stared at the glowing screen while water ran faintly through the downstairs pipes. Then another message appeared. "She still has no idea, does she?" I stepped back from the counter as though the watch itself had burned me. Not because the message hurt. Because I suddenly understood how they both saw me. Naive. Predictable. Soft. The faithful wife standing politely outside her own humiliation. That night, after Daniel fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring into darkness while 21 years of marriage rearranged themselves inside my head. The canceled anniversary trips. The way he corrected me in front of people lately. The subtle comments questioning whether I could handle returning to full-time work. Even the private investigator suddenly made sense now. Daniel needed me emotionally diminished because it justified leaving. People rewrote history whenever guilt became inconvenient. Around 2 in the morning, I slipped quietly out of bed and walked downstairs. The house creaked softly beneath my feet while moonlight spilled across the kitchen floor. I opened the refrigerator, poured myself water, and stood there in silence, listening to the hum of appliances. Then I realized something terrifying. I was no longer afraid of losing my marriage. I was afraid of how much of myself I had already lost inside it. That realization changed everything. The next morning, I met Sandra again. After reviewing new financial records, she leaned back thoughtfully. "Your husband's getting impatient," she said. "I know. He thinks you're still emotionally dependent on him." I looked out the office window toward downtown traffic. Maybe I was. Sandra studied me carefully. But not anymore. It wasn't a question. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked quietly, "What do you actually want now?" The answer arrived before I could stop it. "I want him to see me clearly." Sandra's expression softened slightly. "Most people think revenge means destruction," she said. "But sometimes the most painful thing for someone like Daniel is realizing too late that they underestimated the person standing beside them." That sentence stayed with me all week. And strangely enough, I stopped obsessing over Vanessa after that. Because the affair itself was no longer the center of the story. The real story was what happened to women who spent years shrinking themselves for people who stopped appreciating the sacrifice. A few days later, Mason wandered into the kitchen while I decorated a wedding cake. "You've been happier lately," he said suddenly. I looked up surprised. "Happier?" He shrugged awkwardly. You smile more now. The comment hit me harder than he realized. Children noticed everything, even the grief you tried to hide. I set down the frosting spatula carefully. How are things with Dad? Mason hesitated. Weird. There it was. The quiet truth sitting underneath our entire household. He's distracted all the time, Mason continued softly, and he gets irritated really fast now. I nodded slowly. Then my son asked the question I'd been dreading for weeks. Are you guys getting divorced? For a moment I couldn't speak. Outside evening sunlight stretched across the backyard, while the kitchen filled with the smell of buttercream and vanilla. Finally I answered honestly. I think your father and I are trying to figure out who we really are now. Mason looked at me for a long moment. Then quietly, you seem stronger than him. After he left the room, I stood motionless beside the unfinished cake, while emotion tightened painfully in my throat, because deep down, I think he was right. By November, the atmosphere inside our house had become so tense that even silence sounded exhausted. Daniel noticed the changes in me now. Not completely, not clearly, but enough. Enough to realize I was no longer reacting the way he expected. That unsettled him more than anger ever could have. People preparing secret exits depended on predictability. They needed the other person emotional, confused, desperate, distracted. But the calmer I became, the more uncertain Daniel grew. One Thursday evening, he came home earlier than usual while I was boxing pastries for a corporate catering order. The kitchen counters were crowded with cooling trays of lemon bars, receipts, ribbon, and stacked white bakery boxes. Sweet Haven Bakery had grown faster than I imagined. Not dramatically yet, but steadily. Church events, birthday parties, local office orders, even 2 weddings scheduled for spring. Daniel stood in the doorway watching me quietly. You've been busy, he said. I have. He picked up one of the invoices from the counter. These people are paying almost $400 for a company brunch. He looked genuinely surprised. I almost smiled. That was the thing about invisible women. People often forgot they had skills until those skills became profitable. You never told me it was getting serious. The comment sounded harmless on the surface, but underneath it sat something else. Discomfort. Because suddenly I was becoming harder to categorize, harder to control. I tied ribbon around another pastry box calmly. You never asked. For a second, something flickered across his face. Not guilt. Recognition. The realization that maybe he had stopped paying attention to me long before the affair began. That night, after Mason went upstairs, Daniel sat across from me at the dining room table while I updated bakery orders on my laptop. You moved money from savings, he asked casually. There it was. I kept typing. A little. How much is a little? About 5,000. Daniel leaned back slowly. For baking equipment. Yes. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. You probably should have talked to me first. I looked up then. Interesting. Not because he cared about the money, we both knew he'd secretly hidden far more than that, but because he disliked losing quiet financial authority inside the marriage. For 21 years, I said calmly, I discussed every purchase I made, even small ones. That's not what I'm saying. No, I asked softly. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he sighed. I just don't want you making emotional decisions right now. Emotional. That word again. Suddenly, I understood something chilling. Daniel had spent years subtly framing me as fragile, not openly, never cruelly enough to sound obvious, just quietly enough that eventually even I started believing it. I closed the laptop slowly. Do you think I'm unstable? His expression changed instantly. What? You hired a private investigator, Daniel. The color drained from his face so fast it almost startled me. Neither of us moved. The refrigerator hummed softly from the kitchen, while wind rattled against the windows outside. How long have you known? He asked finally. His voice sounded flat. Tired. Not shocked that I knew about Vanessa anymore, shocked that I knew how far the planning actually went. Long enough. Daniel stood and walked toward the kitchen, rubbing one hand over his mouth while processing everything silently. I watched him carefully. And for the first time since this began, I saw fear. Real fear. Not fear of losing me emotionally. Fear of losing control of the narrative. That investigator was precautionary, he muttered finally. I almost laughed. Precautionary. You've been anxious before. My mother was dying. I know that. No, I said quietly. I don't think you do. He turned sharply. You think this whole situation has been easy for me? There it was. The self-pity. The desperate attempt to reposition himself as another victim of difficult circumstances instead of the architect of them. You were planning divorce before I even knew about the affair. Daniel stared at the floor. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Like this. As though timing was the tragedy, not betrayal. Then how exactly was it supposed to happen? I asked. He looked at me for several long seconds. Then finally, I was trying to figure things out. I felt something inside me go completely cold. Because people always used vague language when the truth sounded ugly out loud. Figure things out. Make a transition. Complicated feelings. All elegant phrases designed to hide simple selfishness. You let another woman mock me publicly, I said quietly. Did you know she was doing that? Daniel's silence answered before his mouth did. And suddenly that hurt more than the affair itself. Because cheating was terrible. But humiliation required participation. I didn't know what she was going to say. But you knew how she spoke about me. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Daniel sat back down slowly across from me. She thinks you've hated me for years. The sentence caught me completely off guard. What? She thinks our marriage has been dead for a long time. I stared at him in disbelief. And what do you think? Daniel looked exhausted suddenly. Older. I think. He stopped. I think somewhere along the way we stopped being partners and started surviving logistics. The words landed painfully because there was truth buried inside them. Marriage could slowly become operational. Bills, schedules, obligations, exhaustion. Years passed quietly while intimacy got replaced by efficiency. But survival did not excuse betrayal. You had choices, I said softly. I know. No, I don't think you do. For the first time all night, genuine shame crossed his face. Not dramatic shame. Not cinematic remorse. Just the quiet realization that he could no longer fully justify himself. And strangely enough, that was the moment my anger began fading. Not because he deserved forgiveness. Because I finally saw him clearly. Daniel wasn't some brilliant manipulator living a glamorous double life. He was a deeply unhappy middle-aged man who mistook attention for meaning and selfishness for freedom. The affair hadn't transformed him. It exposed him. A week later, Sandra officially filed the divorce paperwork. Daniel took it badly. Not publicly, of course. Men like him rarely collapsed where others could witness it. But privately, the cracks widened quickly once he realized I was no longer begging to save the marriage. The first real consequence arrived through his job. Dalton Freight Systems quietly opened an internal HR investigation after multiple complaints surfaced regarding inappropriate workplace favoritism involving Vanessa and Daniel. Expense accounts were reviewed, travel reimbursements were questioned. Suddenly, the affair stopped feeling exciting. Reality had entered the room. The night Daniel found out about the investigation, he came home looking pale. They're auditing everything, he muttered. I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes. I'm sorry to hear that. You think I deserve this? I turned slowly toward him. And for the first time in 21 years, I answered without protecting his feelings. Yes. The strange thing about the end of a marriage is that it rarely feels dramatic every single day. Most days feel ordinary. Someone still takes out the trash. Someone still buys milk. The dog still needs feeding. Mail still arrives. Life continues performing normality even while everything underneath it quietly collapses. By December, Daniel had moved into the downstairs guest room permanently. No official discussion. No emotional announcement. One evening, I came home from delivering holiday pastry orders and found his clothes hanging neatly in the spare closet beside an open suitcase. Just like that, 21 years of shared space divided itself into separate territories. Oddly enough, the silence became easier than pretending. Mason noticed it too. He stopped asking whether things were okay between us because teenagers understood avoidance faster than adults did. Instead, he became quieter around his father, more guarded. The warmth that once existed between them hadn't disappeared completely, but something essential had cracked. Trust always noticed dishonesty before love did. One Sunday afternoon, I found Mason sitting alone in the backyard throwing a baseball softly into his glove while winter sunlight stretched across the fence line. "You okay?" I asked. He shrugged. "Dad's leaving after Christmas, isn't he?" The directness of the question hit me hard. I sat beside him slowly. "Your father and I are working through adult decisions." "That means yes." I looked at my son carefully then. 16 years old. Old enough to recognize betrayal, too young to fully understand the complicated selfishness behind it. Mason stared down at the baseball in his hands. Was it because of that woman? There it was. No more avoiding reality. I inhaled slowly. "Your father made choices that hurt people." Mason nodded once, jaw tight. He lied. Such a simple sentence. And somehow hearing my son say it hurt more than discovering the affair myself. Because affairs didn't just destroy marriages. They damaged the emotional architecture children built around family. "He still loves you," I said quietly. Mason laughed bitterly. "You don't do this to people you love." The maturity in his voice frightened me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then softly, almost reluctantly, he asked, "Are you going to forgive him?" I stared across the backyard while cold wind moved through dead leaves near the fence. Finally, I answered honestly, "Forgiveness and trust aren't always the same thing." Mason thought about that carefully. Then he looked at me. "You seem happier now." The comment nearly shattered me. Because he was right. Not happy in a cheerful sense, but lighter. As though surviving betrayal had forced me to finally stop abandoning myself. The divorce mediation happened 3 days before Christmas inside a conference room overlooking downtown Plano. Sandra arrived carrying 3 organized binders and the calm expression of someone who dismantled dishonest men professionally for a living. Daniel sat across the table wearing a charcoal suit I bought him years earlier for a corporate banquet. He looked exhausted. Older. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. According to rumors from Dalton Freight Systems, she had transferred to another branch office after the HR investigation intensified. Apparently, distance became important once consequences arrived. People who enjoyed secret relationships rarely enjoyed public fallout. The mediation itself lasted nearly 7 hours. Property division, retirement accounts, custody schedules, debt allocations. 21 years of life reduced to paperwork and signatures. At one point, while attorneys discussed financial disclosures, Daniel finally looked directly at me. "I never wanted things to end like this," he said quietly. Interesting sentence. Not "I never wanted to hurt you." Not "I'm sorry." Just regret over the outcome. I folded my hands calmly. "You should have thought about that earlier." His jaw tightened. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because despite everything, part of me still remembered the young Marine who danced barefoot with me in our first apartment kitchen, while cheap country music played through a broken radio. Part of me still remembered the man who held me after miscarrying our first pregnancy 20 years ago. That was the tragedy of betrayal. The good memories remained alive long after trust died. By the end of mediation, the settlement was fair. Not perfect. Not cinematic. Fair. I kept the house until Mason graduated high school. Daniel retained portions of his retirement account, but lost heavily after hidden financial transfers surfaced during discovery. Shared custody was arranged, though Mason already resisted overnight visits. No screaming. No dramatic courtroom speeches. Real life rarely delivered emotional closure that neatly. The real revenge arrived later. Quietly. 2 weeks after New Year's, Sweet Haven Bakery was featured in a Dallas Lifestyle magazine article about women rebuilding careers after 40. Orders exploded almost overnight. Wedding venues contacted me. Corporate clients called daily. One upscale cafe owner even offered to stock my pastries locally every weekend. For the first time in decades, money entered my life attached entirely to my own effort and identity. Not Daniel's. Mine. The night everything truly ended happened unexpectedly in February. Daniel came by the house to drop off Mason after dinner. Rain hammered softly against the windows while Mason headed upstairs to shower before bed. Daniel lingered awkwardly near the kitchen. "You look different," he said quietly. I glanced up from the invoices spread across the table. "How?" He hesitated. "Stronger." The irony almost made me smile. For years, I had carried our family emotionally, financially, domestically through illness, debt, parenting, grief. Yet somehow, only now, after surviving his betrayal, did he finally recognize strength in me. Because independence looked different from sacrifice. "I should probably go," he muttered. But he didn't move. Instead, he stood there staring around the kitchen while silence filled the room between us. Then finally, "I really did love you, Emily." Past tense. I studied him carefully. Tired eyes. Gray at his temples, now more visible than before. A man standing inside the ruins of choices he once believed would lead him toward happiness. And unexpectedly, I realized something important. Daniel wasn't evil. Just weak. Weak enough to chase admiration instead of honesty. Weak enough to mistake loyalty for permanence. Weak enough to gamble his family against temporary validation. And weak people often destroyed the things that loved them most. "I know," I said softly. His expression tightened instantly, almost painfully. Because that answer hurt worse than anger. Then I added, "But eventually you loved being wanted more." Daniel looked down at the floor. No defense. No argument. Only silence. A few moments later, he left. I watched his taillights disappear through the rain from the kitchen window, and strangely enough, I felt peaceful. Not victorious. Not bitter. Free. Later that night, after Mason fell asleep, I stood alone inside my kitchen, surrounded by cooling pastries, receipts, and soft yellow light. The same kitchen where I once cried quietly after feeling invisible. The same kitchen where I rebuilt myself piece by piece while my marriage collapsed around me. And suddenly, I understood the real lesson hidden beneath everything that happened. Revenge was never truly about destroying the person who betrayed you. Real revenge was surviving so completely that their betrayal no longer defined your future. If this story touched you in some way, if you've ever rebuilt yourself after disappointment, betrayal, or heartbreak, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is quietly begin again. And if you enjoy deep emotional stories about resilience, justice, and real human relationships, don't forget to subscribe and join